It's heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching.
I'm sad, I'm hurt, I'm mad because I never would have thought it would have happened here.
The disbelief and pain coming from yet another community, this time Buffalo, where an 18-year-old white man shot and killed 10 people and hurt 3 others at a grocery store in a predominantly black neighborhood in the city on Saturday. 11 of the 13 people shot were black, and police are investigating it as a hate crime. And before we get further into that racist massacre, I want to take a minute to remember the victims, those with full lives stolen from them this weekend. 67-year-old Hayward Patterson, a church deacon who often volunteered to drive people who didn't have transportation to the grocery store. 77-year-old Pearl Young, a substitute teacher whose family says she was a pillar of the community. 55-year-old Aaron Salter, a security guard and retired Buffalo police officer who died exchanging fire with the shooter. 72-year-old Catherine Cat Massey, who was known for her civil rights advocacy and had written a letter to a local newspaper just days before urging passage of more gun control. 86-year-old Ruth Whitfield, who sang in her choir's parish and had been caring for her husband, who was in a nursing home. 32-year-old Roberta Drury, whose family told the New York Times she was always the center of attention and made the whole room smile. 65-year-old Celestine Cheney, whose family described her as a loving mother and grandmother and, quote, probably the sweetest person you could meet. 52-year-old Margus Morrison, who helped take care of his mother, who's disabled. 53-year-old Andre McNeil, whose family called him a loving guy. He was at the grocery store to pick up treats to surprise his grandson. And 62-year-old Geraldine Talley, a devoted mother and grandmother whose family says she was the glue who kept them all together. The shooter admitted to police that he specifically targeted black shoppers and reportedly posted a manifesto just days prior full of white supremacist sickness and a racist conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement, which baselessly claims non-white people are being brought to America to, quote, replace white voters, fueled at least in part by the racist words and actions of former President Donald Trump through travel bans, immigration policies, and dog whistle after dog whistle that have helped normalize white supremacy to the point that local government officials right here seem to think it's fine to joke about bringing, quote, dark friends to events to prove they aren't racist, as we learned last week happened in Everett. I'm joined now by Boston Globe columnist Renee Graham and GBH News senior investigative reporter Phillip Martin, who's been covering white supremacist groups nationally and right here in Massachusetts. Renee and Phillip, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim.
Renee, this is not the first mass murderer motivated by this kind of sickness. There was, 23 people killed in the Walmart at El Paso. The killer talked about Hispanic invaders. The synagogue in Pittsburgh, immigrant invaders, 11 killed there. Is there any reason to think this is the end of the line?
Oh, not at all. It just keeps continuing and continuing. And I think a lot has to change. One thing we have to start with is to cease looking at these as lone wolf attacks. They are not. They are, I'm not saying that they all knew each other, but they certainly influence each other. You could see in the manifesto from the alleged Buffalo shooter, things that were in a manifesto written by a man in New Zealand who attacked 2 mosques and killed 50 people. There is a thread that connects all of them. This is a concerted effort to push this idea of white replacement theory, which has gone mainstream, which has always been on the fringes of white extremism, but is now very much part of the mainstream, including the Republican Party.
I want to talk about it entering the mainstream in a second, but Phillip, your reporting suggests that this kind of sentiment is not alien to Massachusetts either.
Oh, not at all. We're seeing it here. And to Renee's point about the connecting tissue, if you will, of what this movement is, the fact that these individuals, they may act as individuals, but of course, they're not alone. In other words, they're not lone wolves. They're connected by something that's also called White Lives Matter, which is a movement of disparate individuals and groups, including some here in Massachusetts, NSC 131, something called the National Social Club. They are a part of this grouping of white supremacist groups that rely on mainstream messaging, that which have become mainstream messaging, including the Great Replacement theory, no matter what you call it. The Camus, not Albert Camus, but the other Camus, Ronald Camus in France, coined this notion of Great Replacement theory, and it's taken hold in the United States, reverberated on Fox News, and heard by hate groups, echoed by hate groups here in Massachusetts. As I mentioned, Jim, NSC 131 is one such group. They have been parading around the state for more than 2 years now, including at the recent St. Patrick's Day parade, trying to scare people and telling white people through flyers, online publications, through social media, that they are, in fact, in danger of losing their place in American society. A reference, again, to the Great Replacement theory, and as Renee said, reflected in Republican Party talking points these days.
Well, let's hear from a Republican who echoes both of your sentiments. This is Liz Cheney on Twitter this morning. The House GOP leadership has enabled white nationalism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. History has taught us that what begins with words ends in far worse. GOP leaders must renounce and reject these views and those who hold them. You know, you mentioned a minute ago, Renee, that this used to be fringe extremist stuff, now mainstream. Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson on Fox News, members of Congress, as you and Liz Cheney mentioned, the presidency, at least a president. When did it make the jump, and why did it make the jump from the fringes to, as you say, right in the center of American culture?
Well, I think there are two things important to note, Jim, that this isn't new, that this has been going on not decades, but for centuries. You can go back to the New York draft riots in 1863, and what drove those riots was the idea that whites feared that emancipated Black people were going to take their jobs, that they were going to be replaced by emancipated Black people. And that set off a race massacre in New York that killed 1,000 people, most of whom were Black, who were either beaten to death or lynched. This isn't new. Where things changed was in 2015 when Donald Trump ran for president. And he kept stressing this point, we are going to take back the country, which fostered the idea that something that belonged to certain people had been stolen from them. Once he became president, he continued to double down and triple down on that idea. And that gave it credence, that gave it legitimacy. And that allowed a lot of people who might have thought this in the back of their minds to suddenly say it out loud. So the line from Donald Trump to having sitting senators and representatives saying this, to hearing it in prime time every single night on television, you know, isn't that hard to believe? But that's the problem. You know, once a president of the United States was saying it, and a lot in the media didn't want to confront what he was saying because they were talking about economic anxiety and not the pure racism that was behind it, that legitimized this movement.
I want to stay with you for a second, Renee, though. He wasn't talking about economic anxiety 2 years later after Charlottesville. Here's what was being said in Charlottesville, and here's the infamous response from Trump. Here it is.
You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us.
You also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
That was the tipping point for people who'd been disconnected to this, Renee, was it not? That was the invitation in, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I can remember after Trump spoke, and even when he spoke immediately after what happened in Charlottesville, David Duke congratulated Trump. He was happy that Trump did not call them out. That was affirmation for these people. And that's exactly what Trump did. And every time the media refused to push back, refused to call Trump out on his racism, to even call him a racist, they also gave it credence and they gave it power.
You know, speaking of the media, you mentioned Fox News, Phillip. I want to play a second of Tucker Carlson. If people haven't seen this, the New York Times about a week ago did a brilliant analysis of all the shows that Carlson has done, and they documented that on at least 400 segments, he talked about that which he said he never advanced, which is the Great Replacement theory, white supremacy. Here's just one example from earlier in the year.
Everyone wants to make a racial issue out of it. Ooh, the white replacement theory. No. This is a voting rights question. I have less political power because they're importing a brand new electorate. Why should I sit back and take that?
You know, someone texted us today on the radio, Phillip, and said, you know, okay, he's the top-rated show, but it's only so many million people. And another listener directed us to an analysis Google had done that talked about the 3 spikes ever in searching for white supremacy. One of the 3 was after people had called for Tucker Carlson to be fired because of those kinds of statements. So there's a direct line between Carlson's mouth and this infecting as broad a spectrum of the culture as it has, is there not?
Absolutely. These things are amplified. Tucker Carlson may have 3 million viewers on any given night, for example. That's amplified many times over on social media. You'll see that on Twitter. You'll see that in social media, on social media platforms preferred by the far right, such as Telegraph. And so it's not a question of whether or not it's simply confined, if you will, to one show, because it isn't. It's amplified. The same thing is true with hate groups, for example, in Massachusetts, and for that matter, Rhode Island and across New England. They may, in fact, represent about 20, 30 people at most, and have a demonstration of 20, 30 people at most. But what they're saying is often amplified. The Patriot Front, for example, another white supremacist group, here in Massachusetts and in New England, they have put up posters and banners throughout the area, again, talking about the victimization of white people because of policies of equity and diversity. I've seen comments in newspapers, local newspapers, defending them, saying, how can you in fact describe them as white supremacists? Because they're in fact saying what we believe. And so you have comments that are essentially reverberated by these groups that might, as Renee said, at any other time in the past, might have seemed extreme post-civil rights, but have now made their way into the mainstream without question.
You know, Renee, there's been some conversation of the weapon that this guy has used, and one of the perverse parts of this is, you know, the BS line from the NRAs all the time, the way to prevent this is just arm everybody. And of course, Aaron Salter, the guard, was armed, shot at this killer. He had body armor on, and then the killer ended the life of Aaron Salter. It seems to me that even if gun control was in the mix, which it surely is not, it doesn't cure the disease that you are both describing. What does?
You know, I think there's a few things. I do think that this is yet another time to have a conversation about gun reform and how it is that an 18-year-old could not buy a pack of cigarettes legally, but could buy a weapon of war, not to mention body armor. But I also think, and I was feeling this throughout the weekend, is that at some point, white people in this country need to carry this load. It is too much to ask of Black people and brown people and Jews to have to constantly deal with this while being targeted and burying their dead. People need to talk to their families. People need to see what's going on with their kids, because a lot of these people who are doing these things are quite young. This guy was 18. The shooter in Charlottesville was in the shooter in Charleston, South Carolina, was in his early 20s. This is a problem, and it cannot be only carried by the people who were targeted. This is not a Black problem. This is an American problem. And I believe that all Americans, including white people who might feel like they can sit on the sidelines because they are not racist, that's not good enough anymore.
Jim,
because what's happening is going to impact them as well.
I literally have 30 seconds, Phillip. It's yours.
Jim, I just want to add to that. A psychologist I spoke with said it's a slippery slope to go from, for example, Franklin High School recently shouting anti-Semitic racist comments into descending into white supremacy and possibly even joining these groups. And so folks, parents, everyone has to watch what your kids are watching and seeing online, because that's another source of hate.
And when you have politicians like we have in Everett who use the N-word and talk about inviting their dark friends to show that they're not racist.
Exactly.
You've got to deal with that right in your own backyard as well. Renee Graham, Phillip Martin, as always, really appreciate your thoughts. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.